Dear learners, welcome to the Bachelor course on Human Rights. Today we will discuss the very evolution of international standards of human rights, part 1. It is very interesting to note that every society, every culture has its own set of human rights values, and these collective values give rise to what we know as international human rights today. This lecture is dedicated to this beautiful journey of evolution in 2 parts. So, let us begin with part 1. Romans contributed to the development of law since 455 BC by way of the law of the 12 tables. A commission of 10 men was appointed in 455 BC to draft a code of law binding upon all and sundry. The Corpus Civilis, the most comprehensive code of Roman law and the basic document of all modern civil law, was compiled by the order of Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in 533. The contribution of all these legal texts was paving the way towards codified laws. In the period of 304 to 232, the Indian king Ashoka installed rock edicts throughout his kingdom's territory, highlighting the principles related to treatment of prisoner of war, religious toleration, and of course justice, along with abolition of capital punishment and torture to all living beings. In 1100 AD, King Henry I of England issued the Charter of Liberation, granting freedoms to church officials and nobles, another step to give rights in a codified manner. In Spain, the monarchs had constituted courts for advisory function, which constituted of nobles. In the 12th century, these courts were expanded to include members from the middle class, which symbolized the increased scope of rights to the people. In 1930, the world saw its first parliament in Iceland called the Althing. The Great Charter, known as the Magna Carta, was signed on 10th June 2015 by King John and his barons. It reiterated the Charter of Liberation and brought the king on equal footing to nobility and made him subject to rule of law. In France, during the same time, Philip the Fair mooted a bicameral system for taxation. First estate consisting the clergy, the second consisting the nobility, and the third having the commoners. Parliaments came in several other countries of Central Europe and Scandinavia, for example, Sweden's Riksdag. Although the masses had little role to play in these newly founded institutions, however, it was a beginning of a new era of democracy. In the 17th and 18th century, there were remarkable developments in England which proved to be the plinth of international human rights. The American contribution to the development of human rights is no less than that of England. Rather, being a colonized region, the American developments are perhaps more relevant for the study. The slogan of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, in 1789 has a great historical significance and equally great contemporary relevance. Some scholars believed that the slogan of the French Revolution has been the plinth for the categorization of modern human rights in 3 generations, as is known by the world today. The Congress of Vienna 1814-15 also played a role to strengthen human rights norms as it brought the Europe together for reconstruction after the war. Till 19th century, few countries like Britain, France, United States and Spain, to name a few, had established individual rights. Till 19th century period, the concept of human rights had gone through a slow growth. However, the developments of the 20th century contributed to an unprecedented growth of human rights norms. In the modern era, the international and regional organizations played a very important role in promoting and enhancing the human rights movement throughout the world. An overview of these developments is to be discussed ahead in the lecture. We are now going to discuss the developments of human rights at international level. As we were just discussing in the previous part of this lecture, different countries were bringing in their own understandings of democracy and therefore of human rights. The concept of human rights was not being referred to per se, but without referring to the term as such, the movement had already begun. Having mentioned the rich heritage of these rights, now we will discuss the international developments towards concretization of these rights. In modern times, the humanity was subjected to tough challenges during the world wars. The damage done during the First World War was tried to be compensated by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. One of the efforts made by this treaty was the establishment of the League of Nations. The League, in its covenant, created the International Labour Organization, ILO. This organization is understood to have made initial efforts to institutionalize human rights, more particularly the economic, social rights of the labor class. I would now discuss the role of the League of Nations, the predecessor of the United Nations, in the promotion of human rights. Let us look at what the League of Nations did vis-a-vis human rights development. At international level, the first steps to institutionalize human rights was taken by the League of Nations. The League of Nations was established through the Treaty of Versailles, as we discussed, in 1919 in response to the horrors of the First World War. Article 13 of the Treaty of Versailles provided for the establishment of the International Labour Organization, ILO, which was adopted as an independent treaty and had set the agenda regarding humane conditions of labour for the organization. The ILO was finally established by the Treaty of Versailles on 14th December 1919 as an autonomous body of the League. The ILO was then kept as a special wing of the League. The League of Nations was founded immediately after the First World War. The covenant of the League provided for three main constitutional organs, and those were the General Assembly, representing all the member states, an executive council with the membership limited to major powers, and a permanent secretariat. Now, all of these organs of the League of Nations, it was mainly the ILO which carried out the activities related to human rights. The ILO adopted a range of conventions and recommendations aimed at a standard setting international labour law and policy. It also was the first international body to launch a complaint mechanism under Article 26 of the Constitution of the ILO. It is beyond doubt that the motivation and inspiration behind the establishment of the ILO came from the human rights approach. The preamble to the ILO Constitution begins with the intriguing words which say, "Whereas universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based upon social justice." These words suggest that the prime focus of the ILO was on the protection of economic and social rights, which later got categorized as the second generation of human rights. The ILO survived the League and became member of the United Nations system after the discontinuation of the League in 1946. Another reason to discuss the ILO in this lecture is that ILO has also been quite helpful in regional developments vis-a-vis human rights. However, the most important works for the promotion of human rights were done by the successor of the League, that is the United Nations. We will now discuss the role of the United Nations ahead in the lecture. Now, let us look at the United Nations and its role vis-a-vis the promotion and protection of human rights. After the Second World War, the need for an international argument to avert a similar tension was felt even stronger. It was only after the birth of the UN in 1945 that the nation started thinking in terms of human rights at international level, and the United Nations was successful in launching a human rights movement. The growth of the UN began in 1941 with the Declaration of St. James Palace, and the final shape to it was given in the San Francisco Conference in 1945. The overview of the 4 years of developments towards the United Nations is what we are going to discuss further. The first step towards the establishment of the United Nations was the 4 freedoms given by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States of America. He mentioned in his speech, which was a speech to the 77th Congress on 6th January 1941, in this speech he highlighted the 4 freedoms in which he considered the freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom for fear, and freedom from want. These 4 freedoms were known to be the objective of the United Nations in coming future. The next development towards the establishment of the United Nations was, of course, the Declaration of St. James Palace in 1941. It is also known as the London Declaration. It was signed on 12th June 1941 by the delegates of Great Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Union of South Africa, and some of the United Governments. The declaration was signed at the ancient St. James Palace, hence the name. The next step was the adoption of the Atlantic Charter in August 1941, 2 months after the declaration of St. James Palace. This charter was neither a treaty nor a declaration, it was only a consent to a set of principles. On 1st January 1942, the United Nations Declaration was adopted as the next step towards making of the United Nations. The Moscow Conference was held on 30th October 1943, and the Moscow Declaration was proposed as a general international organization based on the principle of sovereign equality of all peace-loving states. The purpose of this conference was to further define United Nations as an organization. The declaration for the first time articulated basic principles of UN peace and security. This conference was followed by the Moscow Declaration on Atrocities on 1st November 1943. This declaration was also signed during the Moscow Conference. In this conference, Winston Churchill, FDR Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin proposed the post-war trials of the Nazis for atrocities, massacres, and cold-blooded mass executions. The importance of this declaration was that it showed the retrospective concern of the community of nations that these countries were trying to set examples for deterring other states for any such violations of human rights and peace in future. In the same year, the Tehran Declaration came up. Continuing the efforts towards the establishment of the United Nations, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill met in Tehran, Iran in December 1943. The Moscow Declaration was emphasized during this conference. The declaration read, "We are sure that our concord will win an enduring peace. We recognize fully the supreme responsibility resting upon us and all the United Nations to make a peace which will command the goodwill of the overwhelming masses of the peoples of the world and banish the scourge and terror of war for many generations." Meanwhile, a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide to refer to the Nazi Germany's acts during the Second World War. It was important to seek an international trial of the Nazi soldiers for the war crimes they committed, because it meant that crimes against humanity and on such a scale cannot be ignored by the international community as a matter of state sovereignty. It also hinted upon the punitive aspect of violation of peace and human rights of the innocent people, even if it is at the hands of the state. It was also an indication of the simultaneous growth of humanitarian and human rights law. Both these branches of international law have given unprecedented importance to an individual who otherwise had no role to play in so-called laws of the nations. As the UN Charter was very near to be actually drafted in 1944, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference was held at a private mansion with the same name, Dumbarton Oaks. The delegates of Britain, USSR, China and the United States met here. The purpose was to design the United Nations on the lines of principles and proposals put forward in the conferences of the past. The discussions were carried on during the series of meetings held between August and October of 1944, and a proposal for the structure of the World Organization was submitted by the four powers. The next event was the Yalta Conference from 4 to 11th of February in 1945 at Yalta, Crimea. The question of voting procedures for the Security Council was also discussed. The conference concluded by announcing that there will be a conference of the United Nations to be held at San Francisco on 25th April 1945. Before the San Francisco conference, the Potsdam Declaration was adopted in 1945. The big three, that is the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the US President Harry Truman, met in Potsdam, Germany from July 17th to August 2nd of 1945 to negotiate terms for the end of the Second World War. One of the articles in the declaration reiterated the atrocities of 1943. It said, "Justice shall be meted out to all war criminals, including those who have visited cruelties upon our prisoners." It was a very crucial parallel movement to secure human rights with a retrospective look. It was being very well reported by the prospective initiatives to promote human rights and peace by way of creation of the United Nations. The pre-decided San Francisco Conference, also known as the UN Conference on International Organization, UNCIO, was held finally on 25th April 1945 to discuss the proposals for the UN from Dumbarton Oaks and Yalta conferences, along with the individual proposals of other states. The conference continued for 2 months in full sessions and carried on by small committees and resulted in the drafting of 111 articles of the Charter of the United Nations. A lengthy debate on the veto rights of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council was also held. The last session of the conference was held on 25th of June 1945, and the Charter was passed unanimously and signed by 51 states. The UN came into existence on 24th October 1945 with 5 plus 24 ratifications. Several states emphasized on human rights issues to be included in the UN Charter. The human rights concerns can be seen throughout in the UN Charter, which highlights that the rights of an individual are no longer a concern for only the state. Rather, it is an international concern. The Charter was the first document of the United Nations mentioning universal human rights. President Truman, at the closing address at the San Francisco Conference of 1943, spoke of human rights as referred in the Charter as, "The Charter is dedicated to the achievement and observance of human rights and fundamental freedom. Unless we can attain these objectives for all men and women everywhere without regard to race, language or religion, one cannot have permanent peace and security in the world." It was suggested during the San Francisco Conference to substitute the word respect for human rights with the stronger word observance of these rights. In place of promoting, words like assuring or protecting were also proposed. However, these suggestions were not accepted. The implication of such terms will be highlighted in the discussion ahead that we continue to do so in the course. The Charter laid down a full-fledged system of human rights monitoring with the help of the various provisions of the Charter itself. An overview of one of the monitoring systems of human rights monitoring, the Charter-based human rights system, will be discussed later on. The establishment of United Nations was a turning point for the setting of standards of human rights at international level. Soon after the UN was formed, the member states of the United Nations pledged to promote respect for human rights for all. To advance this goal, the United Nations established a Commission on Human Rights and entrusted it with the task of drafting a document spelling out the meaning of the fundamental rights and freedoms proclaimed in the Charter. The Commission, guided by Eleanor Roosevelt's forceful leadership, captured the world's attention. On December 10, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, was adopted by the 56 members of the United Nations. The vote was unanimous, although 8 nations chose to abstain. The UDHR, commonly referred to as the International Magna Carta, extended the revolution in the international law ushered in by the United Nations Charter, for example, bringing an individual directly under the international human rights concern. Because the UDHR meant that how a government treats its own citizens is now a matter of legitimate international concern and not a simply domestic issue. It claims that all rights are interdependent and indivisible. Its preamble eloquently asserts that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. The influence of the UDHR has been immense. Its principles have been incorporated into and inspired several constitutions of the world of different nations. Although a declaration is not legally binding document, the Universal Declaration has achieved the status of customary international law because people regard it as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations. In addition to this declaration, the United Nations has also made an exemplary work of drafting and enforcing the human rights covenants as treaties. These covenants and treaties are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its optional protocols, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Together with the Universal Declaration, they are referred to as International Bill of Human Rights. The ICCPR focuses on such issues as the right to life, freedom of speech, religion and voting. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights focuses on such issues as food, education, health and shelter. Both covenants encourage the extension of rights to all persons and prohibit discrimination. In addition to the covenants in the International Bill of Human Rights, the United Nations has adopted several conventions, and these are Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination 1965, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights 66, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights again 1966, Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women 1979, Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment 1984, the Convention on the Rights of the Child 1989, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Family 1990, the International Convention on Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance 2006, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities 2006. The journey of setting global human rights standards does not stop with the works of the United Nations only. There have been regional efforts to do the same. In Europe, in Americas and Africa, regional documents for the protection and promotion of human rights extend the promises of International Bill of Human Rights. For example, the African states have created their own Charter of Human and People's Rights in 1981. The Arab states have created under the Cairo Declaration, the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam 1990. In Southeast Asia, similar efforts have been made by a declaration under the ASEAN in 2012. We would be dealing with the mechanisms of the United Nations in order to uphold the human rights in the world in the second part of this lecture. That should be it for today's lecture. I hope you enjoyed the content of the lecture and you felt intrigued by the idea of human rights itself. We will keep discussing similar topics on human rights. Till then, keep learning, stay happy. Thank you.